Hi there, I'm June Hogan. I'm a career coach and outplacement specialist, and I'm the founder of outplacement services provider Wildwood Coaching. This is a recording of a free monthly lunch and learn session that I run with my colleague Robin, where each month we dive into different aspects of managing redundancies. This month we're covering individual redundancy consultation meetings. So we talk about best practice, the structure, the outline, how you can prepare line managers, and also what to do about recording meetings and taking notes. So these sessions run once a month, they're completely free, and there are details in the description if you'd like to join us live or to receive notifications of future recordings. I hope you find the session helpful, and as always, if there are comments, queries or questions, then do please get in touch. And in the description you'll also find lots of other information where you can get support in managing redundancies and also details of our outplacement services as well. We'll get started then. Thank you all for joining us today. It's lovely to see some familiar faces and some new ones as well, so that's always nice. So that's what we're going to be covering today as a quick outline in the next hour, and we'll make sure we're finished on time. So we're going to talk about the principles of individual consultation, give you a bit of an outline, the structure of those meetings, what the agenda should follow, how you can prepare line managers, just some insights on recording meetings, because that's the thing now, I think, for lots of people, any reasonable adjustments that you might want to consider, and of course your questions either throughout the session on chat or at the end we'll do Q&A. Okay, so for those of you that haven't met us before, we'll do a quick 60 seconds of why we're here. If you have heard this before, then make a cup of tea or something. So my background is I've got a 25-year, probably more than that now, background in corporate HR. It started in the automotive industry and I worked there for 8 years, progressed to senior HR business partner, and I was made redundant without notice and the company went into administration. So that's my first experience of redundancy at the time. I then navigated a quite challenging time in my life. I was out of work for 18 months navigating my second son, which was lovely, and illness, which wasn't quite so good. So I found another role at Wolseley, which was the world's leading supplier of plumbing and heating products at the time, when I was HR business partner there, where I also managed redundancies and restructures. And then 8 years later, I'm not sure what the 8 years thing is, I was made redundant whilst on maternity leave. And after a career break, I decided to take up the opportunity to go and live overseas with my family. And whilst I was there, I trained to become a coach whilst living in North America. And then back in 2018, I returned to the UK. I had no job to go back to. And so I thought I'd give self-employment a go. And I decided to specialise in outplacement support, which brings together my personal experience of redundancy, my professional experience of managing redundancies, and also my coaching qualification and experience. And since then, my team and I have been helping hundreds of people, working with organisations, navigating change. And I really enjoy the work. It aligns with my values, and I see the difference that outplacement support makes to people every day. So that is me, and I had to breathe during that. But Robin, over to you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Yeah, so I've been in the HR space for, I don't know, 25 plus years, and 20 of those years have been as a self-employed consultant. The last 17 purely my own business, which is FHR Solutions. Predominantly done lots of kind of interim type roles at the beginning of that period, and worked for some large multinational organizations. And probably about 5-6 years ago, really started to specialize in all things redundancy and TUPE. So the two areas where a lot of HR people kind of go, that's a horrible side of HR. But I find it both challenging, complex, and keeps the grey matter active. And it's where I probably add most value to organisations these days. In terms of the redundancy programs, they range from literally just 1 or 2 people, all the way up to 1,500 people. So the processes are different. Every redundancy program is different, be it because of the business rationale, be it the organisational culture, and also the individuals involved. I think that's what keeps my attention and focus on making sure that the preparation and the processes are good for the client, and also, I hope, good for the individuals who are going through what is not a nice process to go through for anybody. So yeah, that's me in a nutshell.
Wonderful. Thank you, Robin. And for anyone that's just joined us, we are recording the session for the purposes of YouTube, but it's only mine and Robin's cameras that are pinned. And if you want to ask questions during the session, you're welcome to do so in the chat, but we will be stopping the recording and then having a sort of open Q&A just towards the end if there's time. Let's crack on. So in terms of the redundancy process, if you haven't already got one of these, if you've been on my email list for a while, you might have seen one of these. I'll pop it in the chat anyway. That just gives you an overview of the redundancy process as a whole. It's actually quite a nice thing to share with line managers, maybe who aren't familiar with the process, and give them a bit of an overview. So I'll put that in the chat in a minute. You're welcome to download that. So Robin, let's talk about some of the best practice principles of an individual redundancy consultation meeting. That's our focus for today, and just making sure that people have got that kind of overview based on your experience. So do you just want to give us a bit of a feel for those points there?
Yeah, so I mean, in terms of when we get into the individual consultation, so obviously, if it's more than 20, you've done the collective side, and a number of elements would have already been decided upon, i.e., things like redundancy calculations. Are you going to pay pylon? All those kind of bits would have already been done. If it's less than 20, then obviously, you've got to think through you're going to have to be, when it comes to the individual consultation, going to have to be a little bit more detailed. So you're going to have to combine what you would have done in the collective and actually kind of squeeze that into the individual. But the principles of consultation are very much you've got to make it meaningful and fair for all individuals. You definitely want a consistency on the individual consultations. So I tend to follow a quite well-worn path of using scripts, which, if you've listened to us previously, myself and June have a slight variation of opinion in terms of scripts. In terms of, I like to use them, or I like managers to use them to make sure that they are consistent throughout the whole process and they don't miss any points. But the downside of using scripts is you don't have to read every word, but you've got to make sure you cover all the elements of that individual consultation. You need to make sure that prior to going into any consultation process, that the managers actually know what they're doing and what they're trying to achieve. The whole purpose of individual consultation is to mitigate against a redundancy and try and find ways of avoiding it where possible. So, if an individual kind of says, well, have you thought about doing X, Y, and Z? The manager needs to be prepped, not to just rule that out totally without even considering it. They need to consider, any representations that an individual puts forward. And that's vitally important. And sometimes that consideration shouldn't just be a no. It needs to have that time and effort of the business taking that question away and actually then coming back to the individual at a later time to kind of go, well, we have considered it, and the answer is no, or actually we have considered it and the answer is yes, and we can do this and this and this, but you need to take the appropriate time to consider any representations, and that will make it meaningful if you've done so in the proper way. Kind of other elements, people might be on holiday, people might be on long-term sick, people might be on maternity. You still need to make sure that you consult with them and make sure that they're given us exactly the same opportunities as everyone else. So they're, and we've covered it in another session around maternity and those kind of things. So I'm not going to go into that detail on this webinar, but there are particular points in there that they should make sure that in your communications plan, you're reaching out to those individuals if they're away from the business. In terms of documentation and follow-up, when I tend to do programs, I have a template which I tend to use that gathers all the information. It goes through, do you understand what at risk of redundancy means? Do you want me to go through the calculations, review scores if there's been selection criteria used, and look at suitable alternative employment? So having that template really helps the flow of the discussion. And from my point of view, I tend to have the script that kind of aligns with that template. And of course, the most important thing at the end of that is the actions. It could just be, send the notes to the meeting, and it should be in a reasonable amount of time. The next day or the day after. Are we going to send a copy of the calculations? And then it's to answer any outstanding questions that they may have. And it's really important that you don't just save up all those questions. It's actually, really good that you come back to that individual at the earliest opportunity to make sure, because, sometimes that individual consultation might be as short as 10 days. So you don't want to be waiting until the final consultation meeting with the individual to suddenly start answering all these questions, and then the individual has more questions, because then, you would still need to consider any representations that they have, and you don't really want to be delaying the outcome of confirming redundancy if that's what the outcome is likely to be. So you need to be making sure that you answer all those actions as quickly as you possibly can. So from an HR perspective, if it's an HR question, then that will rely on the HR person. If it's more operational, then obviously, the manager running the consultation should answer them. But you need to take notes, make sure that it's accurate, because you never know, you might need it at a later stage. The last one on there is about making reasonable adjustments. So I have found over the last couple of years, the days of doing redundancy consultations face-to-face, there's a lot of people these days who actually prefer to have it online, which, if we go back 5 or 6 years ago, pre-COVID, people would have looked at HR and kind of in disbelief that's what's happening. But I did a small redundancy the other day, and it was actually quite amazing that we gave them the option. And a couple of them were neurodiverse and were very specific of, no, I definitely want to do it online. I don't want to do it face to face because of this and this and this. And it's like, hey, that's absolutely fine. But, where you can make adjustments for those individuals, then absolutely do. Other adjustments could be that, if it is face to face and they don't want to do it in the office, you might want to do it off site somewhere. But, make sure it's an appropriate place, not in a McDonald's or a coffee shop, which, has happened previously, that I'm aware of, which obviously is not appropriate. So you do need to make sure that if managers are looking at alternative venues, it's in a private location. In some offices, you have that lovely fishbowl office that, has windows all the way around. Again, think about how you would feel, or the employee would feel, if you're in that situation with everyone looking in. It's a private meeting, it's a sensitive meeting, and you've got to show empathy. Because I know full well that if I was going through, formal type meeting redundancy, I wouldn't want everyone looking in. Just think about how you're going to actually schedule in the individual consultation meetings.
Thanks, Robin. And we'll go into a bit more detail on some of those. And just as you were talking there about that notion of not waiting for all the questions to kind of waiting for the next meeting or waiting until the end, I think that's a really important point to keep the process moving and to keep individuals informed, because some of the things that I notice when I work with people at the end of the process is that they will kind of reflect on the fact that, the communication wasn't great, as in, we only ever got to talk to somebody in a meeting and that kind of thing. So I think that's really important, and giving people options and flexibility about those adjustments. And for those of you that are into podcasts, I've got a podcast, and there are some episodes on there where we go into a lot more detail around reasonable adjustments for making the process fair and inclusive. What might that mean for someone who may be navigating, excuse me, menopause, for example, or somebody who might be on maternity leave? So if you are into podcasts, check those out. And also there's a blog which has got the episodes on if you're not into listening and you'd rather read. So yeah, there's a lot more detail over there. So in terms of the consultation outline, what we're talking about here is sort of best practice. And I love that word here, the gold standard, in terms of, it's not that you can have as many meetings as an individual might need, but fundamentally it's just making sure that you've met some of these requirements. So just talk us through these, Robin. I mean, you've alluded to the transition between collective consultation and individual consultation. And yes, of course, those might overlap and that it is a proposal. But typically when you're going through an individual consultation with somebody, you've got here the minimum of 2 meetings, but you prefer 3. So just talk us through why the 3 and not the 2 that is kind of the legal minimum.
Yeah, in terms of it needs to be meaningful. I mean, that's the law speaking. A minimum is the first meeting is for, you are potentially at risk of redundancy, and the second meeting is if nothing has changed, then it's confirmation of redundancy. So those are the 2 meetings that you have to do. There's no debate around it. In terms of slipping in a third meeting, I'd normally suggest that happens in larger organizations where the propensity of having suitable alternative employment comes into the equation. And normally you split it out. A day 1 meeting is the first meeting, the day 15 for the second meeting is more of a review around the suitable alternative employment and training and those kind of elements. And then only the third one, if there is no suitable alternative employment, is confirmation of redundancy. So you tend to find, especially in very large organizations, they will tend to do the consultation over a 30-day period. In public sector, it's a minimum of 30 days, and normally they're written into their redundancy policies anyway. But yeah, if there's no chance of suitable alternative employment, so for example, I've just finished an assignment this week, which the whole site was closing, but there is no suitable alternative employment within the UK. In the preparation for that timeline, then it was very much of we were only going to do 2 meetings, and we're going to do it over a 10-day period. But normally, I would suggest that in most organizations and redundancy programs, there's always an element that there's a possibility of suitable alternative employment, and hence it does stretch out your timelines. And that's why it's really important that when you start preparing for a redundancy scenario, you kind of think about the organization that you're in, what is the likelihood of people finding suitable alternative employment, and how much time have you got? Is it because you're having to reduce headcount so much because of cost, and therefore to delay it by another couple of weeks might take the organization into administration or something? Then actually you're going to have to move really quickly. Whereas most organizations, you would probably suggest that they've got a longer time to do it in. And I think it's better for some individuals. Some individuals will kind of go, I don't want any individual consultation. I just want out. I don't need that. And, where can I sign on the dotted line to say, I don't want any consultation, just give me the money and I'll go. So, everyone's different. Every scenario is different. But when you come to do the preparation and your timelines, then you've got to start thinking about what fits that organization there. And, where you have the collective consultation and the individual consultation, if it's more than, the 100 and you're having to do 45 days minimum consultation, collective consultation, the line is you can't let anybody leave within that 45 days, but there's nothing stopping you starting your individual consultation a little bit earlier. But you need to be a little bit careful on that, because you need to still make sure that your collective consultation is meaningful. So it may be that in some circumstances, where there's availability of a voluntary redundancy program, you may want to have those conversations in the collective consultation really early, i.e., hey, we want to do a VR process. It may be by settlement agreement as well. And we're going to open the window after we've agreed what the calculations are for that VR process and get the employee reps or trade union to agree to that. If you've got a redundancy policy, it might already be written down what that VR is. So it's a little bit easier if you've got to negotiate on what the package is likely to be, then it may not happen until maybe the second consultation meeting for the collective until you've kind of landed on, a reasonable VR package. But once that's done, you can then almost start the individual consultation process as well. But all I'd say is, probably seek advice on that at the time to see if it fits, and that's why planning is so important when you come to running a redundancy process. But it can save you, a lot of time. Otherwise, worst case scenario is when you're planning out your redundancy, and the chief exec says, "Well, how long is this going to take, Robin?" Well, you can say, "Well, it's going to take 75 days." Because we need to do the initial briefing, we need to do the election of reps, which could take 10 days. And then we do the collective consultation for 45 days. Then we do the collective consultation for another 30 days. You end up with quite a long timeline. So sometimes you have to push back to the senior leadership teams to kind of say, well, this is how long it takes. We can maybe do the individual consultation as parts of so we can overlap it with a collective consultation to squeeze that timeline. But it needs to be done by, agreement with the senior leadership team to make sure that it fits the organisation and what they're trying to achieve and how many people are going or potentially going. It all comes down to the preparation.
And that's the topic of our next session in July, actually, Robin. Obviously, you knew that, didn't you? Yeah. Planning for redundancies. So we're going to dive into the detail of all of that loveliness there. Okay, cool. Anything else on that one? Because we talked about you need a redundancy policy, and you can only have the final meeting after meaningful consultation.
Yeah, and the bit about it's proposed and until the final consultation meeting where you have to come to an outcome. You're either not redundant or you're redundant. It's quite binary. But before then, everything is always proposed because you never know. The individual might find suitable alternative employment, might come up with some interesting way of avoiding the redundancy. And it's proposed. And I know it gets repetitive for individuals, kind of saying, well, just make a decision. But actually, the legal framework that we have to work in, it's always going to be proposed until it's confirmed.
Absolutely. And that sort of leads into when we're talking about how to prepare managers in a moment. So in terms of the structure then, in terms of, getting somebody to the meeting, kind of setting up the meetings, we talked about location before in terms of not in a fishbowl. And when I was on maternity leave and I was at risk of redundancy, we weren't in a fishbowl, but I had to walk through the whole open plan office, which might not sound like a big deal, but that's the first time you've been back in the office since having a baby, all I wanted to do was obviously not be there, but then I then had to walk out of the office having heard the news and that kind of thing. So that might not seem like a big deal. It was a private office, but the actual location for me was not great. It would have been just nice to have had the meeting in the office that was literally in the front door. But anyway, that's those are the small details that can make a difference to people. So obviously you're going to have the invitation letter, you're going to have the email, at least 48 hours notice wherever possible. So just talk us through that then in terms of, setting up the meetings. There's some obvious points here about, not trying to cram in, 15 meetings in a day and giving everyone 15 minutes and that kind of thing. But just share some of your experience around that.
Yeah, so, in terms of, it depends on the complexity of the scenario. So, in the scenario, the whole site is closing and there is no suitable alternative employment and there's been no selection criteria, then actually the consultation is going to be quite short. So yeah, you can definitely kind of schedule in 30 minutes for that, and it may be a lot quicker. When there is scoring involved and an individual wants to go through the criteria in absolute detail, then actually you should probably be putting in at least an hour. And sometimes it might overrun. When you are scheduling multiple meetings in a day, you want to make sure that, if it's a complex one, it's an hour. And then you probably want 15, 20 minutes between each meeting, just to allow for any potential overrun, but also, a little bit of, take a breath and reframe yourself and get ready for the next person coming in. Because if you've been doing that for 8 hours solid, when you get to the person at the end of the day, you're not going to be on best form, either you as the HR person or the manager running it. So, you've got to think about trying to schedule it in, which, it is reasonable. And I know that, sometimes it may mean that your schedule is, for the next 2 weeks, person A had theirs on at the beginning of the month, and you're still doing the first consultation meetings for the person at the end of the alphabetical list, as it were. But, I'd say don't rush them, don't try and squeeze them in. I think probably earlier on in my career, I think my record, was probably doing 13 or 14 in a day. And that was starting at 7 in the morning and finishing 7 or 8 in the evening. But it wasn't great. I don't think it was a great experience for me. Definitely wasn't for the manager. And I think that probably as a learning point, not to be repeated. So yeah, learn from my mistakes. I think a maximum is probably 6 or 7 in a day, and that's pushing it. It's a little bit easier if you're doing it online, because you can kind of plan stuff, and you can take some of the onus out of taking notes if you're recording it, and having automatic notes doing as well. But yeah, do try and split things up as best you can. And if you need to bring in the whole of the HR team to help out, then hey, that's fine. But don't try and do everything in the minimum amount of time, because it's not conducive for anybody.
And I think what you said earlier there, Robin, about giving people the option as well, in terms of, if that's practical, do you want to have it face to face? Would you like to have it online? And we'll talk about reasonable adjustments at the end. But just thinking about the individuals, and not every, as you say, you might need to plan in a bit longer for some individuals, because you know that potentially they might have more questions, and so it's just not just getting the spreadsheet and assuming it's all going to run neatly to plan.
Yeah. And different organizations do different things. I remember doing something for a big pharmaceutical company. And, it was very much of, okay, Robin, your 40 people are based down in the southwest, and we're going to put you up in a hotel for 2 weeks, a month, to look after those 40 people, and they will come to you. And from my perspective, that was, well, okay, that's fine if that's the way the business want to do it. And I can remember probably having one individual turning up with a 6-week-old baby in arms, which I look back now and kind of go, oh, we probably should have done it slightly differently. But I was unaware that that was the individual had a newborn with them, and then vice versa. The big IT organization, with 1,500, it was going to be absolutely impossible to see them face to face, because they were scattered all over the country. And everything was done online for those individuals. So different organizations will do different ways. For people who are in one office, it may be a little bit easier. But again, as I said earlier, you may want to do it off site to help individuals out during that process.
And I think, it may or may not be possible for you to be that close to everybody as a HR professional, but using the line manager's insights and thinking about some of that flexibility. So I think that's, yes, there's a structure, yes, there's an outline, but we need to be aware of individuals. So I'm going to talk about preparing line managers in a minute, but before we do so, just the typical agenda then of an individual consultation meeting. And I should have said that I'm going to share a summary of the session at the end and a little lovely Canva handout. Do like a bit of Canva. So these are the kind of the basics that you're going to need to cover in an individual consultation meeting. So, and I know you've talked about script, Robin, and I'm, as an individual, I'm not against the notion of a script. Certainly, you're going to need a structure. And as you said earlier, the script isn't about sort of sitting like this, but the script is about planning and when you're going to look up and connecting with the individual, etc. And I did a podcast interview with somebody, the podcast going out Thursday actually, and they were reflecting on some of their experiences managing redundancies. And one of the things that they said, which kind of stuck with me, is they were in a meeting and they had some notes and they got the structure. And one of the individuals said to them, why are you reading from some notes? Am I not important enough? And I thought that it was a really good response because the HR professional, she said, you are important, but I've got 6 people to see today and I need to make sure that everyone receives the right information. So the reason I use a script and a checklist is because everyone is important. And I thought that was a really nice way of framing it rather than people thinking they're kind of being processed. And that's why you're just kind of head down ticking things off because everyone's equally important. The first person at 9 o'clock or the last person at 4. So yeah, but anyway, tell us a bit about the agenda and the things that you need to make sure that are covered.
Yeah, so the business rationale for redundancy, it's critical. And yes, it will get repeated, especially if you're doing collective consultation, the briefings and communications, etc. It's really important to get it right first time. If you start chopping and changing it halfway through the process, it just looks strange and it looks like the company didn't really know what they were doing. So you need to put in the time and effort to make sure that, hey, it's a valid reason for redundancy, but also the rationale backs that up on why the organization are doing it. And most individuals will kind of go, oh, okay, I get it. Some individuals obviously will never get it, but actually, if you're consistent with your message and you're going to repeat it probably a dozen times throughout the whole process, and if you can explain it and why the company are doing it, I think it probably puts people in a better place. In terms of the other, the main element of consultation is to mitigate against redundancy. So it is about exploring alternatives, be it suitable alternative employment, be it in some organisations reducing hours worked. It could be for a limited amount of time. There literally are hundreds of different things that an individual can look at in terms of what alternatives could there be. So now I've had it where we're moving location and it's 30, 40 miles down the road, but it's a call center where majority of people haven't got a car. And one of the representations was, can we put a minibus on? And it's kind of like, oh, that's a good point. Let's go away and consider that and look at the costs of having a minibus pretty much on 24/7 because it's a 24/7 call center. And when the cost comes back and it's 150, 160,000 pounds a year just on the transport costs, it's actually I'm not quite sure that's going to work in that particular case. It could have done, but not in that particular scenario. But you need to explore those alternatives. A big one is obviously reviewing the selection process and the scoring. And for some individuals, it can be a bit of a blockage in terms of, no one has ever told me that I'm rubbish at my job. Well, it's not quite what you're saying. What you're saying is, hey, we've scored you in, and here's the criteria that we've gone through. Everybody can do the job because otherwise we would have taken you down other pathways. It's just that other people have, be it additional qualifications. Again, the selection criteria is a whole another podcast, June. But some people, and you don't share other people's scores. You just kind of say you are technically you are below the line, and hence that's why you're at risk of redundancy. But if there's a particular area you want to discuss, we can, reevaluate, why we gave you that score. If you've got further evidence to kind of say, oh, actually, didn't I tell you I've got an MA in that field and you haven't taken that into account? Okay, you might have to rescore. And in some circumstances, that might take them out of being at risk and it might pop someone else down. I mean, it's not great for the person who thought that it was safe and then they're now at risk. But until the end of the process, you're not confirming if people are redundant or not. So that can sometimes take a long time to go through, and that's why when you're doing the scoring, or managers are doing the scoring, they need to be really accurate and give a rationale of why they've scored that person a 1 or why they've scored that person a 5, and give practical, rationale for the scoring so that they can relay that back to the individual at the individual consultation. It's definitely to ask questions. Have you got any questions? Have you got any representations? Is there anything you want to ask? And to keep on asking. Some people might be, well, what happens to my pension? What happens to my bike to ride scheme? What happens to my Bupa medical insurance? What happens to my company car? They are literally, and sometimes if it's the first time a redundancy program has happened at an organization, then there's going to be lots and lots of questions, and there might not be an FAQ sheet that you've done in the past. I think my advice is try and get some of the really basic FAQ documents ready before they do the individual consultation meetings, because then you're not going to get asked those questions 1,000 times. And it just, saves energy. People have more clarity of what's happening. So where possible, list those 50 odd, FAQ questions that are going to come up as HR professionals. And then keep adding to it, because if one person's asked it, you can be assured that someone else is going to ask it. So the quicker you get that, update the FAQ document, then everyone knows, not just the HR people and that one individual, but also the managers as well. And it's outlining what the process is, how it's going to happen, what the next steps are. Obviously, when you get to the final meeting, you need to let them know that there is an appeal process. How long is it going to be, etc. You will obviously, when you confirm redundancy, send them a letter that has all that information in, but you should also put it in the final consultation template as well, just to remind them that, hey, we've given you a copy of the appeal process. Most commonly, it kind of mimics what, if you haven't got a redundancy procedure, then I would suggest your appeal process mimics either your grievance or disciplinary process, be it, hey, you've got 10 days to appeal the decision, etc. And then obviously they would have another consultation appeal type meeting to review what's gone on. It should be someone different. Normally I'd swap out the HR person as well. And obviously it should be a different manager. Sometimes in really small organizations, that's not going to be possible. But hey, that's the same with a disciplinary type dismissal. If it's a small organization, yes, the MD can do both. But where you can swap out, swap out. And I think I said at the beginning about, get the notes out sooner rather than later. If you're using Teams and you've got an automatic note taker, personally, I'm quite happy these days just to kind of go, well, there's a copy of the transcript, and then you don't have to write up mammoth amounts of notes. But with the action points, make sure you do bullet point them to make sure that it's clear and easy to see. And when you send the email with the transcript, you can kind of say, and these are the outstanding actions as you go through the process. Some of them may be easy to answer. Some of them you might have to go away and do some research or think through it and consider them in greater detail and effort.
I think that's a good point about the notes, and we've got a bit of that at the end as well, in that just attaching one of these transcripts that goes on for pages and pages. If somebody's still shell-shocked, confused, isn't really sure what's happening next. And it's good to actually still put the human into that and just summarize things. So I'm going to do a couple of bits now on preparing line managers, and this in itself is probably a whole other session. And again, there are some podcast episodes I've done specifically on this if you wanted to look at it in more detail. And I am working on a custom GPT. That sounds very technical, doesn't it? Which is designed, that I've kind of trained, that is designed to help you use it to help prepare line managers for consultation meetings. But I've just got a bit stuck with the tech. So it is coming, but I'm not quite sure when it'll be with you. But because you're on my email list, then you'll get notifications. So I think preparing line managers is about, yes, they need to understand the process and the legal framework, which is important. As you said before, Robin, it's about making sure that it isn't a predetermination. So it is about keeping options open. It is about this being a proposed process. But I also think when you're having those sessions with line managers, preparing them for these meetings, it's about talking about the risks, giving them some guidance on the sorts of things that they can say and can't say, not to kind of frighten them, but to make that point that if someone doesn't know, it's far better to say, I'm going to make a note of that, I'll go away and come back to you, than feel like they have to be the manager that knows everything and that, is kind of in control here and I've got all the answers. And I'm sure you and I have come across lots of managers like that. But this is about understanding this is all part of that legal process and also ensuring that it is a consistent process. As you said there before, Robin, about having the structure, having the information, having the script where they're going to use one, but making sure that they still come across as a human. And this is something that again, I've noticed through working with individuals and through talking to people on the podcast, is that having visibility outside of the consultation meetings is really important because. And I've worked with individuals who've been talking to me. So we're having outplacement discussions and they've said, oh, I've got these queries about the process. And I said, well, it's not my place to answer them, but you can go and talk to your manager. And they said, well, I haven't got a meeting for 2 weeks. I'm like, well, no, just go and find them. Go and find them and have a chat. And if they need to take you into a formal meeting, so they think that's appropriate, that's what they'll do. But if not, then, so I think it's important to help line managers understand the importance of visibility and checking in with people and, saying, how are you doing? Should we go and grab a coffee? Have you got 5 minutes? Let's go for a walk, whatever. Because again, I've had individuals share with me that once they were put at risk of redundancy, their manager just never spoke to them again, which is awful as well as ridiculous. So it's, I think, setting the scene about it's a legal process and that flowchart might be helpful, or talking it through with them so they see how their role fits in all of this, but making sure that they are still putting the human at the centre of all of this. Now, this is a very quick overview, but those skills in the meeting around, and again, you as HR professionals will be able to sort of give some insights and some examples around what does active listening actually look like in a redundancy consultation meeting, which is about removing the filter, which is about being open, which is about listening to understand rather than listening to respond. And so if somebody is reacting in a certain way or responding or asking questions that isn't in line with what a line manager might be thinking is reasonable, well, that's not what they think, it's the individual and what they're going through. So that active listening, I think, is really important, and being able to capture what's going on, preparing them for how to handle emotion, which can be very hard. So if you're not able to be in the meeting with the line manager, and that's not always practical, then just getting them aware of what could be some of the typical responses. So you might have people that go into shock and just glaze over. You've got the people that get angry, and you've got the people who will break down and in tears, and probably anything in between as well. But just preparing them for that, and what does that actually mean, and what should a manager do in that situation? Again, I've done an episode on that, and it isn't about necessarily trying to fix things, because that's not going to be practical or helpful, but mainly giving the individual the space to just let that emotion come out, and just to give them that opportunity, and to acknowledge, and also to manage silence as well. I think sometimes our managers feel they have to kind of fill the gaps, and sometimes somebody just wants time to think and time to just react to what they've just heard. So I say we could talk about this probably for a couple of hours. That defensive language, I remember being in a consultation meeting once and I thought I'd done all the preparation. My manager said, well, if it was up to me, I wouldn't be doing this at all. I was kind of like, oh my God, oh, did you really just say that? Or, well, that it's it's not my decision, all that kind of thing. So they need to be brought into the process. They need to understand their role and that they are accountable. They might not agree with the decision that's been made, but they're there representing. Keeping the meetings human. So yes, I think the scripts are important. But if you've got a script, then asking them to prepare in their own way and kind of put some breaks in there where they're going to look up and they're going to check in or they're going to say, how does that land with you? Have you got any questions? As Robin said, you need to make sure you've got the understanding and not being afraid to use adjournments. Because if somebody has just gone into shock or is completely overwhelmed or is their emotions have taken over, there's no point just ploughing on because it's not going in. So offering them the opportunity to take a break and come back in sort of 15, 20 minutes, whatever that might be. So I think that's important as well, because the way that those meetings are handled sort of sets the tone for the whole process. So I've gone through that relatively quickly, but I think it's just having it on your radar when you're preparing line managers, not just for the process, but also for how they might approach and some of these things that might come up, because it is a difficult meeting to have. And particularly if you've not done it before, and these are members of your team, these are people you've worked with, maybe they might be friends as well as a line manager. And I think sometimes there can be a level of fear of going into that meeting. And so if you can try and break some of that down for people and take away some of the unknown, then I think that's helpful from sort of a human perspective. We've got a few minutes, which we'll do some questions in a minute. I think we talked about recording meetings, didn't we, Robin? In terms of, I mean, I've just put some notes here around people are increasingly requesting them. I don't think it's an issue, as you said, but just considering some of these things in terms of how you're going to then record. And it's the same for any meeting that you might be recording. It's no different, is it? And you might still get those kind of phones turned on in the background, as it were. But I think, yeah, as it said there, it's deciding your approach in advance, letting people know they can, as you say, you can put the record button on if you're online. If someone's in person, you're happy for them to record it on their phone. I don't know. I mean, it's just about being clear and consistent. Any thoughts on that, Robin, if you're in person and somebody wants to record the meeting?
Yeah, I think if you're doing a face-to-face and they want to record it, it's kind of say, yeah, that's fine, but please send us a copy of a recording afterwards. Um, yeah, I think because I've done, obviously it's my area of expertise. I know full well that I'm not going to say I'm not going to use the word never, but I'm reasonably competent and confident in people recording me because I'm not going to necessarily say something that I shouldn't say. And vice versa, if you trained your managers properly, then you would hope that they wouldn't say anything out of turn as well. So if you followed the right steps through, then actually, hey, if you want to record it, go ahead. I actually find that from an HR perspective, actually saves a lot of time, especially on where you've got, I'm not going to call them a difficult person, but if it's going to be a difficult conversation, as the HR person, do you just want to be sitting there taking reams and reams and reams of notes of an hour, which could be many, many, many pages, and you're not really listening on what's being said or able to respond? You're just writing furiously away. So actually have the computer doing it for you allows you to kind of step back a little bit and be able to help the process, help the manager, and help the individual. Did you mean to say that? Can you give more clarification rather than just having your head down taking notes? So personally, I'm more comfortable recording conversations and having the automatic transcript. If we go back 10 years ago, that didn't really exist. And, you'd probably spend double the amount of time taking the notes, making sure that they're correct, and then sending the individual a copy to say, do you agree with these notes? And if they were a difficult employee, then you'd get the, no, you've missed this bit out and this bit, and I didn't say this. And you'd kind of go, oh, my recollection is slightly different from yours, but, we will put it in brackets and have both versions in, where actually, if it's recorded, there's no debate. takes out one of those areas which, in the past, and I'm talking about them in minority of the cases, but they're the high risk ones going forward. My personal perspective is just record it. It's easier.
And what you said there about then obviously sharing the recording and then deciding on how you store it and that kind of thing. So, okay, thank you, Robin. Now, I'm conscious that we approaching 1 o'clock, which it's such a complex area. Even when we just dive into like one element, we can just go into lots of detail. So I hope that you guys have found that interesting. If you have got any questions, please do put them in the chat, and we're happy to answer them. We're going to talk about reasonable adjustments. I'm just going to leave that up there in the interest of time. Just a few things on there. These are some things that you'll probably be aware of. Making sure, as we said before, giving people the option about how they want to have the meeting, virtual meetings, being flexible around individual circumstances, etc. And considering if you need some extra input from occupational health and whether somebody might need particular accessibility needs and also additional time to respond. So there's a lot of information for someone to take in, particularly neurodiverse colleagues, then thinking about, well, how do you present that information? Do you present that in advance in the meeting? Do you present it in small chunks, that kind of thing, and give them more time? So sorry, I've just brushed through that one. Robin is available. You can find him on LinkedIn if you're not already connected. If you want any expert advice, guidance or consultancy for any redundancy projects. And I've got lots of information on my website to help you manage redundancies. And also, if you're interested in providing person-centered outplacement support, then that's what we're all about. That's really small. No, I need to make it bigger, even though it is small print, basically saying we're here to give you advice and you do need to seek independent advice. And we're back in July before we take our summer siesta sabbatical for August, and we're talking all things planning redundancy. So if you want to join us then, you'll get the notification coming out on email. And it's our second anniversary, Robin, which is very exciting. There may have to be virtual cake. I don't know if I can submit to real cake. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Robin, as ever, for your download. And we'll see some of you next month, maybe, for planning redundancies. If not, maybe we'll see you in September, which feels like forever away, but I'm sure it'll go quickly. Thanks, everybody, and have a lovely afternoon.